Hello everybody. Today's lesson is another lesson on English Language Paper 2, Question 5. It's a very straightforward lesson because we're just looking at some of the techniques that were used in the article that I set you last week, and some of the other techniques that you could use when you're writing to argue or persuade. So really we're looking at the icing on the cake. So remember I said to you last week that the really important thing in this question is that you have some really good ideas in order to have a solid argument. And that's the cake. And the icing on the cake is the techniques. It's how you organize your writing. So the first thing we're going to do is look at some of the punctuation that was used in the article. And the first thing that we saw, or I saw, that wasn't something that you would automatically know exactly how to use were dashes. So you can see here an example how she used dashes in the piece of writing. And the purpose of dashes are that they create a longer pause than a comma, but they can act in exactly the same way to separate out a subordinate clause. So you could just use them to add a little bit of extra emphasis to the point that you're making that might be within commas. We also see an example of, just here, we see an example of the use of parenthesis or just brackets. And they are used to give a little bit of extra information about something in the sentence. It's usually some more information about the thing that's just come before the brackets. And when you're reading a play and the character speaks to one side as if they're speaking to themselves or just to the audience, brackets can almost act like a bit of an aside. If you want to put punctuation in to a bracket, the punctuation has to apply to the thing that's within the bracket. So here you could put an exclamation mark in to add even more emphasis. And because that applies to the thing that's in the brackets, you put that within the brackets. Any other punctuation that is necessary in the sentence goes outside of the brackets. So in the article that we looked at, she didn't use square brackets, but I thought I'd put them in here just to remind you what they're for. So they're used to show that an element of a quotation has been changed. So if we were quoting Lucy Hawkin, we could say Lucy Hawkin said that she was writing to Katie Hopkins to ask her to stop. The bits in square brackets have been changed from the original quotation, and I've changed them so that the sentence makes sense. So that's what you do. You use square brackets when you want to use the quotation as part of your own sentence, but you need to change elements of it slightly to make it make sense to the reader. So a semicolon, you can see an example of how she's used it here. It's on YouTube. You can watch it and see how the audience responds. The semicolons are usually used to join two independent clauses, and what that means is the two clauses, the two halves of the sentence, need to be able to stand on their own. So you should be able to take the semicolon out, replace it with a full stop, and have two sentences that can work on their own. Otherwise, you can't use a semicolon there. It's usually used a semicolon instead of a conjunction like and or because. But in the case above, she seems to have used it to replace the word therefore. So it's on YouTube. Therefore, you can watch it and see how the audience responds. So, for example, a more common use would be, he was really hungry, semicolon, he ate 3 apples and a banana. Semicolons create a pause which is longer than a comma, but not as long or as definite as a full stop. So if you want to bring someone's attention, bring your reader's attention to something, but you don't want them to come to a full stop, you could use a semicolon instead, but it has to fulfill the other criteria as well. Another great and underused piece of punctuation is the colon. So the colon points the way to information which follows it. So an example is below. So there are 3 things that you need to make sure that you do to stay up to date with schoolwork during isolation. Attend lessons, take notes, and complete work set. So the second part after the colon just gives you information about the thing that went before it. Another way of thinking about how the colon works is to think if you could replace it with a phrase like and that is or and they are, a colon might work. So there are three things that you need to make sure that you do to stay up to date with schoolwork during isolation, and they are attend lessons, take notes and complete work set. So you can take and they are out and put a colon in. Okay, so most of the other punctuation that she's used is pretty straightforward. So one of what I would do if I was writing this piece, because you need to use a range of punctuation correctly, I would just before you start writing, just draw out all of the pieces of punctuation at the top of your page, and then think about whether or not you can use where you can use them, so you create a variety in your piece of writing. What we're going to do now is look at some of the structural techniques that Lucy Hawkins uses, and they're very straightforward. It's just not anything very complicated at all. So first of all, she uses some short paragraphs and some longer paragraphs. And within those paragraphs, she uses a mixture of more complex sentences. She doesn't really use highly complex sentences. She doesn't have sentences with lots and lots of different clauses in. They're relatively straightforward, but they are some more complex versus some short, simple sentences. So some 3-word sentences, for example. You might choose to use 2-word sentences or 1-word sentences. Sometimes you might even choose to use very, very short 2-word or 1-word paragraphs, only if it fits in with your overall argument, though. Another really successful technique is the repetition of the same word or clause at the beginning of successive sentences. That draws attention to the point that you're going to make. It acts like a sort of real emphasis. You can also repeat the same word or clause at the end of successive sentences. So, for example, you could say, she uses, don't you think kids with autism have enough to deal with already? Don't you think that they already face enough rejection and social isolation with you making it worse? Do you really think they need you to tell them that they don't fit into society? So she uses the same beginning clause, don't you think, and then just a variety of that in the third sentence. Do you really think? That slight change in the final sentence adds even more emphasis because of the really. That's just, you know, you can imagine if you're reading that, you really stress that word. Other structural techniques that could be used that Lucy Hawkins doesn't use, but you could use bullet points, you could use numbers, you could use a circular kind of text, so you begin and end in the same kind of place. So you might start your writing with a particular clause, or you might end it with a particular clause, or even the whole of the same sentence, beginning and end, or just the same word. It creates a circularity, sort of wraps the reader up in your argument. You need to use all of these techniques with caution because they can be overused and used when it doesn't really make sense. So you need to make sure that what you're writing really needs that kind of structural device. Another very commonly and very effectively used persuasive device, or a device used when you're writing to argue, is rhetorical questions. So when she's saying, don't you think kids with autism have enough to deal with already, she's using rhetorical questions, and she has a list of 3 different rhetorical questions. So those questions are designed to have the effect of making the reader or the addressee question their standpoint if it differs from that of the author, because it gets you thinking about whether or not you really should think those things. Another really effective persuasive technique is listing. So in the example below, he's very sweet, polite, hardworking, kind, and generally lovely. When she's talking about her son, what that has the effect of is creating a sense of an abundance of good qualities that her son has. And therefore it makes anyone who implies mocking him to be acceptable seem unreasonable and cruel. So it's a very effective technique there. Some of the other very commonly used persuasive techniques are humour. If you use humour, you tend to relax your audience, so the audience is more open to your argument, perhaps. direct address so that it seems like you're talking directly to the person who's reading the article. Triplets, so the rule of three, when you're repeating something similar 3 times, seems to be sort of a magic number. It works really well to get a point across to a reader. Hyperbole, so exaggeration. Litotes is under exaggeration, so you often use it for comic effect, but under exaggeration can also draw attention to something. And anecdote, so a personal type of story which illustrates a point that you're trying to make. I have to say what's really, really important in terms of writing to argue is getting the tone right. It's the tone and the information that you use that are the really persuasive things. It's content and tone, so the cake, the argument, and the tone, the words, the vocabulary that you use to convey your message, and how you structure it in order to make sure that you're getting the tone right, so the tone is appropriate for the audience that you're aiming for. And you need to read a lot of examples in order to practice getting the tone right for yourself, because it is a hugely difficult thing to achieve. Okay, so what I would like you to do now is to read the article, There May Be Water on Mars. I don't need you to look for the punctuation, but you might notice it along the way. You might notice some of the other techniques, but the techniques that I want you to really focus on are the use of hyperbole, so exaggeration, emotive vocabulary, so words and phrases which have been deliberately chosen to create an emotional effect in the reader, because as soon as you have an emotion towards something, you're naturally engaged, you're receptive to it in one way or another. If you're either going to switch off from it, or you're going to really be open to listening to something. And I want you to look at how the writer uses humour to get his point across. There may be flowing water on Mars, but is there intelligent life on Earth? We may be captivated by the thought of organisms on another planet, but we seem to have lost interest in our own. The Oxford Junior Dictionary has been excising the waymarks of the living world. Adders, blackberries, bluebells, conkers, holly, magpies, minnows, otters, primroses, thrushes, weasels and wrens are all now surplus to requirements. In the past 4 decades, the world has lost 50% of its vertebrate wildlife, but across the latter half of this period, there's been a steep decline in media coverage. In 2014, according to a study at Cardiff University, there were as many news stories broadcast by the BBC and ITV about Madeleine McCann, who went missing in 2007, as there were about the entire range of environmental issues. Think of what would change if we valued terrestrial water as much as we value the possibility of water on Mars. Only 3% of the water on this planet is fresh, and of that, 2/3 is frozen. Yet we lay waste to the accessible portion. 60% of the water used in farming is needlessly piddled away by careless irrigation. Rivers, lakes and aquifers are sucked dry, while what remains is often so contaminated that it threatens the lives of those who drink it. In the UK, domestic demand is such that the upper reaches of many rivers disappear during the summer. Yet still we install clunky old toilets and showers that gush like waterfalls. As for salty water, of the kind that so enthralls us when apparently detected on Mars, on Earth we express our appreciation with a frenzy of destruction. A new report suggests fish numbers have halved since 1970. Pacific bluefin tuna, which once roamed the seas in untold millions, have been reduced to an estimated 40,000, yet they are still pursued. Coral reefs are under such pressure that most could be gone by 2050. And in our own deep space, our desire for exotic fish rips through a world scarcely better known to us than the red planet's surface. Trawlers are now working at depths of 2,000 meters. We can only guess at what they could be destroying. A few hours before the Martian discovery was announced, Shell terminated its Arctic oil prospecting in the Chukchi Sea. For the company's shareholders, it's a minor disaster, the loss of $4 billion. For those who love the planet and the life it sustains, it's a stroke of great fortune. It happened only because the company failed to find sufficient reserves. Had Shell succeeded, it would have exposed one of the most vulnerable places on Earth to spills, which are almost inevitable where containment is almost impossible. Are we to leave such matters to chance? At the beginning of September, 2 weeks after he granted Shell permission to drill into the Chukchi Sea, Barack Obama travelled to Alaska to warn Americans about the devastating effects that climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels could catalyse in the Arctic. It's not enough just to talk the talk, he told them. We've got to walk the walk. We should embrace the human ingenuity that can do something about it. Human ingenuity is on abundant display at NASA, which released those astounding images, but not when it comes to policy. Let the market decide. This is the way in which governments seek to resolve planetary destruction. Leave it to the conscience of consumers, while that conscience is muted and confused by advertising and corporate lies. In a near vacuum of information, we are each left to decide what we should take from other species and other people, what we should allocate to ourselves or leave to succeeding generations. Surely there are some resources in some places, such as the Arctic and the deep sea, whose exploitation should simply stop. All this drilling and digging and trawling and dumping and poisoning, what's it for anyway? Does it enrich human experience or stifle it? A couple of weeks ago, I launched the hashtag Extreme Civilization and invited suggestions. They have flooded in. Here are just a few of the products my correspondents have found. All of them, as far as I can tell, are real. An egg tray for your fridge that syncs with your phone just to let you know how many eggs are left. A gadget for scrambling them inside the shell. Wigs for babies to allow baby girls with little or no hair at all the opportunity to have a beautifully realistic hairstyle. The iPotty, which permits toddlers to keep playing on their iPads while toilet training. A £2,000 spider-proof shed. A snow sauna, on sale in the United Arab Emirates, in which you can create a winter wonderland with the flick of a switch. A refrigerated watermelon case on wheels, indispensable for picnics, or perhaps not, as it weighs more than the melon. An automatic watch rotator that saves you the bother of winding your luxury wrist candy. A smartphone for dogs, with which they can take pictures of themselves. Pre-peeled bananas in polystyrene trays covered in cling film. Just peel back the packaging. Every year, clever new ways of wasting stuff are devised, and every year we become more inured to the pointless consumption of the world's precious resources. With each subtle intensification, the baseline of normality shifts. It should not be surprising to discover that the richer a country becomes, the less its people care about their impacts on the living planet. Our alienation from the world of wonders with which we evolved has only intensified since David Bowie described a girl stumbling through a sunken dream on her way to be hooked to the silver screen, where a long series of distractions diverts her from life's great questions. The song, of course, was Life on Mars.